Good morning friends, welcome to the point. In today's video we are going to discuss a very simple topic called budget deficit. With the word deficit, one thing should automatically pop up in your mind, that is deficit means whenever there is expenditure more than the revenue, it leads to deficit. Now the same thing stands for the government as well. Whenever the government spends more than its revenue, it lands itself in a situation of a deficit called the budget deficit. I'll explain you with a daily or general life example. For an example, your salary is 20,000 a month. Now what if you spend 30,000? At the end of the month you will be left with no money and you will be in the situation of deficit. So same as with the government, when the government spends more than its revenue, it lands itself in the situation of deficit, and it is called as budget deficit. Budget deficits has its three parts, that is fiscal deficit, revenue deficit, and the primary deficit. On all these three topics there are separate videos, but as of now we are just concerned with the budget deficit. In case of budget deficit, we take the total expenditure and the total receipts. So expenditure has two parts. First is capital expenditure and the revenue expenditure, and the receipts also like this. So the capital receipts and the revenue receipts. In case of the budget deficit, we calculate or we consider the total of both of these. So in case of expenditure, we add this figure, and in revenue we add this, and the total expenditure minus total receipts. So in case if the expenditure exceeds the revenue, it is the situation of deficit. In case the revenue exceeds the expenditure, it is the case of surplus. And when revenue is equals to expenditure, it is known as balanced budget. I hope you are clear with all the three situations as to how they arise and in what circumstances. Moving on to the next slide, which talks about how is it calculated. As I have told you, in case of budget deficit, we take the total of expenditure and the total of the revenues. And what is the total of revenue? It is the capital receipts plus revenue receipts. And what is the total of expenditure? It is the capital expenditure plus the revenue expenditure. And we reduce this way, and the figure that comes is the budget deficit. Moving on to the slide, which talks about the causes of budget deficit. So the first one is excessive government spending. So again, I would like to relate this thing with our daily life. So whenever we spend more than our pocket money, or whenever we tend to spend excessively in comparison to our salary, what we earn, we end up having a deficit at the end of months. So same as with the case of the government. When the government spends excessively more than its revenue, it lands itself into a situation of deficit. And the next thing is, even if the expenditure is constant, let's suppose the expenditure in 2019 was 10 crores, just hypothetically, and in 2020 also it is 10 crores. So if you see the expenditure is not changing, but what if your revenue changes, and the change is caused due to the lower level of taxation? For example, in 2020, if the government reduces the rate of tax, so what will happen? It will decrease the amount of revenue collected by the government. So the expenditure remaining the constant, which was in 19 also and in 20 also 10 crore, but the revenue gets reduced, let's suppose to 8 crore. So again 10 crore minus 8 crore is 2 crore, again a situation of deficit. So these are the two major reasons why the budget deficit is caused to the government. And the next slide about is the consequences of the budget deficit. So the first one is that whenever, okay, again I will explain you with the help of a general or day-to-day life example. So whenever you are at the end of the month, you have already spent your pocket money. So what do? You go to your friend and borrow money from your friend so that you can manage the expenses till the time your salary comes again or the pocket money comes again. So same happens with the government also. When the government is in deficit and wants to spend or manages expenses, what it does is they go for borrowing, that is they take loan from the external sources or internal sources, which in turn increases their expenses. How? Already their expenses are in more than their revenue. Now to cover this or to manage the expenses, they are borrowing. So if you see the final effect, in turn they are increasing their expenditure. Why? Because first they are borrowing the loan or taking the loan, plus they have to service interest over it. So what is the effect of it? Their expenditure gets increased even more. So this is one of the major consequences of the budget deficit, that the government resorts to borrowing. The next concept that you need to understand is that budget deficit, is it always a negative thing, or could it be a positive thing as well? So friends, it is not always a negative thing, because sometimes the government needs to spend more than the revenue it earns in order or for the development of the nation. For example, if the government plans in next 5 years that whole of India should be well connected with the roads, railways and the ports, so they need to spend excessively to develop such a network. So if you see in the next 5 years, that is from 2021 to 2026, if you see the government's spending, it would always be, or it would be most of the time, in excess to the revenue it earns. Why? Because they have an objective to achieve, and the objective is that they have to connect whole of India through a good network of rail, roads and ports, which in future would definitely generate revenues for the government, as well as would lead to the development of the country. How? That the transportation or the mobility of of the transport will be faster. In fact, more and more industries would develop around the ports, because now they know that the roads are being developed properly for the faster communication or the mobility or transportation of the goods. More and more investments would come in for setting up the factories. So sometimes government need to spend for the development of the nation, due to which there is a situation of budget deficit. So we cannot always conclude that a budget deficit is always a negative thing. It could also be a sign that the economy is growing, or is on the path of development. So I hope this topic of budget deficit is clear to you. Regarding its subparts, that is fiscal deficit, revenue deficit and the primary deficit, we will take in the upcoming videos. And for today's video, this is all I wanted to discuss with you all. So thank you so much friends for your patience listening.